My name is Catherine Shelton and I work at Cardiff University, and I'm chairing this event on behalf of the ExChange group. I just want to begin by saying that this event is part of a wider Reframing Adoption conference that's been organised by ExChange this spring. And you'll see in the chat shortly a link to all of the events that the ExChange group have organised as part of Cascade. I want to issue a very warm welcome to Professor Harriet Ward. Harriet is an Emeritus Professor of Child and Family Research at Loughborough University, and she's currently working with the Research Centre at Oxford University as an Honorary Research Fellow. In 2002, Harriet founded Loughborough Centre for Child and Family Research, and that's an independently funded research centre that was designed to produce methodologically sound, policy-relevant research on issues concerning children's social care, and she directed that centre for over a decade. Harriet has over 30 years' experience both as a research director and field researcher, and as an advisor to policymakers and service providers, and also as a social work practitioner. And I'm aware from the people attending today that her work has resonated with many of you across those different domains of activity. But today, Harriet has a particular focus for her talk. She'll be speaking about her work on outcomes of open adoption from care and the Australian contribution to that international debate. She's published a book which is fantastically open access, and you're going to be able to download that book or individual chapters from the book for free from the publishers Amazon, Kindle and Kobo. All the research that Harriet presenting today has been undertaken in Australia, but Harriet asked me to emphasise that the messages from this work are relevant to adoption policy and practice in the UK and indeed many other countries. I know we have an international audience today. So I'm going to hand over to Harriet now and let her begin. So thank you, Harriet, for joining us, and we're really excited to hear your talk.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. Well, it's a delight to be invited to talk about this project. I was writing it up all through the pandemic and it kept me sane. So I'm grateful to it. And I hope that some of the findings will be of use to you and that you'll be able to learn from them. What can we learn from Australian practice, though? Maybe why do we want to look at what's happening in Australia? Maybe that's where we should be beginning. So here are some of the comparisons. I've made comparisons with Wales because I thought most people attending this would be coming from Wales, but I gather there are lots of people from England as well, and indeed from other countries. But nevertheless, I think we need some comparisons anyway, don't we? And the key features, I think, of Australian practice that are different from Wales, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and many other places are, first of all, that a very high proportion of children in care are Indigenous, Aboriginal children, and a very small proportion of any children in care in Australia are placed for adoption. And you can see there's quite a big disparity in those percentages between Australia and Wales. And the reasons for that are all to do with the history of adoption in Australia, which has been problematic, to say the least. There have been numerous scandals. There's the issue to do with juvenile emigrants to Australia. There is the stolen generations issue, the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their birth families. And they also had a huge issue concerning forced adoptions more recently. And it's those issues that have coloured the debate in Australia, but I think has also produced some consequences that are very relevant to adoption practice today. There's a very strong bias against domestic adoptions. So while there is still quite a lot of international adoptions in Australia, there are very few adoptions of Australian children from care. Much of the debate has been led by people who have had adverse experiences of adoption. And as a result of that, there is a huge drive towards open adoption when it occurs, and open adoption requiring regular post-adoption face-to-face contact between children and birth parents is mandatory in New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. And I'm going to be looking at some work that we did in New South Wales. the Australian debate raises all sorts of issues about contact, and certainly I have heard many of these issues raised in the UK and elsewhere as well. One of the concerns is contact can be dangerous. Perhaps it will destabilise placements. Another is that children can be re-traumatised by contact. Another, the courts will never agree to regular post-adoption contact. And another, it wouldn't be possible to recruit adoptive parents if they had to agree to it. Well, those are issues that colour the debate here, and they've certainly coloured the debate in Australia. But we are gradually moving towards increased contact here, and particularly, I think, increased face-to-face contact between adopted children and their birth parents. And this is what the president of the Family Court said quite recently. I would encourage all those involved in adoption planning and decision-making to focus more on the issue of contact and to ask in each case whether the model of life story work and letterbox contact is in fact the best for the individual child in the years that lie ahead for her, or whether a more flexible and open arrangement developed with confidence and over time may provide more beneficial support as the young person moves on towards adulthood. I was asked to look at the Barnardo's Find a Family programme in order to do this research. And there are some key features of that programme that you need to be aware of when you look at the findings from it. So Barnardo's has been running adoptions for more than 30 years now, and they are certainly the lead adoption agency in New South Wales. And New South Wales is the part of Australia where domestic adoptions are far more common than anywhere else. The programme initially aimed to provide permanent homes for children in care who had been identified as hard to place because of age, behaviour, or being part of a large sibling group. So they devised a programme that was really designed to place for adoption children who would be the most difficult to place. And for many years, it was their policy, first of all, to approve potential adoptive parents as long-term foster carers before the children were adopted. And while the children were fostered by these parents, they were offered extensive support until the order was made, but no support after the order was made. Open adoption, which meant regular face-to-face post-adoption contact with birth parents, siblings, and extended family, was mandated by the courts as a prerequisite to the adoption order. That means that everybody had to agree to it, including adoptive parents and indeed the birth parents. And in fact, if they've refused to follow this through, in theory, at least, the adoption order would have been invalidated, though there's no instance of that ever happening. Another part of the Barnardo's policy was that the adoptive parent had to be present throughout contact. And that, I think, is very significant. We don't tend to do that in the UK with children in care with contact. They often go to contact centres and are taken there by volunteers. In these circumstances, the adoptive parent had to be present. And they placed 210 children for adoption, or 210 children were adopted between 1987 and 2013. We looked at those children. We had a cut-off point because we wanted children who had been placed for a relatively long time in order to find out what the outcomes were. We gathered data from everywhere you can think of, really. We had administrative data from the children's trace files, so 210 children who had been adopted. We collected all the data we could from their case files and from the information that was sent to the courts. We then did a follow-up survey of everybody who Barnardo's had contact details of, and we got quite a high response rate. We had information concerning 93 adoptees, and we found out about their post-placement experiences, contact, current situation, that sort of thing. And we chased up a few others who hadn't responded to the survey, and we were able to find out where they were living and whether they were still alive, very basic, minimal information. One of the most successful parts of the study, though, was that we were able to interview a very large proportion of the children and their adoptive parents, almost a quarter of them. We had information of about 25 altogether, mostly from both the adoptee and their adoptive parents. And that told us a lot. That sort of coloured some of the drier administrative data we collected. And these are the key findings from the study. Over 90% of the adoptees have been removed from their parents' care because of serious and often multiple forms of abuse and neglect. There were maltreatment concerns for all but 9 children in the study. I've been doing research in this area for 20 or 30 years now, and I was shocked by some of the evidence of abuse that these children had experienced. They are the really sharp end of child protection cases in Australia and no doubt in the UK as well. We tend not to remember that sometimes, I think. It's painful to look at abuse and neglect. It's painful to focus on it, but we do need to be aware that these children had suffered significant, very adverse circumstances before they came into care. And at entry to care, a very high proportion had had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences and were 4 times as likely as the general population to experience adverse adult outcomes. I don't know if you're aware of the research on adverse childhood experiences. Felicity is the first, the Felicity reference is the first one, but there are many others, and that's quite a significant piece of work that does help us identify the vulnerability of some of these children. These children also had very poor experiences in care after they had been removed from their birth parents. They had failed reunification, they had numerous placements. There were 1 or 2, not a high number, but there were a small number of instances of complaints of abuse while in care as well. The birth parents were struggling with the sort of issues that you will all be well aware of. Substance misuse, mental health problems, domestic violence, and some of them also had learning disabilities. And most birth parents had these types of issues to contend with in combination. Because we were able to follow up the children and because there was contact with birth parents, it was also possible to find out quite a lot about the birth parents, so we weren't able to interview them. But we do know that most of the birth parents did not succeed in extricating themselves from the problems that had led to the child's removal by the time the children reached adulthood. We know that from interviews with the children, well, the adult children, and also with the adoptive parents. And in fact, quite a high proportion of them, 60% of birth fathers and 23% of birth mothers, had already lost contact before the adoption order was made. So Bernardo's had contracted to re-establish contact with these families as far as possible, and they did try to do that. This is the book that is the result of this research. As Catherine has already said, it's free. You can download it from the publishers, and that's the link with the publishers. You can Google it, that's the easiest way to get it. And you can get it onto Kindle or Kobo, or just download it as text. Perhaps I should point out while you're all thinking about this, I'd like to make it clear that this was not an easy ride. I didn't have all those cheerful executive flights to Australia and back and lie around on Bondi Beach, sunning myself and so on. Most of this study was undertaken with long distance Teams or Zoom calls at about 1 a.m. So I'd just like you to be aware of that, okay? What are the questions I'm going to look at, really? The ones I think are most interesting, anyway. What was contact like? How far did it affect relationships between adoptees, adoptive parents, and birth parents? And how did it impact on adoptees' developmental trajectories? What was it? What was it? How did it actually play out? So first of all, what was it like? Well, it happened, there's a start. A very high proportion of the adoptees had face-to-face post-adoption contact with their grandparents. And that was generally positive, not always, but the vast majority was very positive. And there are lovely quotes from the adoptees about what it was like. I like the bottom one, really. It's grandparents and they love you. You assume your grandparents will love you, and many of these grandparents tended to do so. Although it must be remembered, most of these grandparents had been asked if they would be able to provide the child with a permanent home and had felt themselves unable to do so. The siblings. A high proportion were placed with at least one sibling. And where they had been separated, 37% of adoptees had contact with the children from whom they had been separated. Siblings who were placed together generally had positive, felt that it had been a positive experience, as that quote shows. If they don't be separated, then they don't have that empty feeling, that young woman said. She didn't get on particularly well with her sibling, this young woman, from the interview, that's clear, but it was good to have her sibling there. You didn't feel empty if you had a member of your family there. Siblings who are placed apart were more problematic. Many of the children were placed in care while other siblings remained at home, or new siblings were born after they had been placed for adoption and so on. And in those circumstances, although they had mandatory contact with those siblings, they didn't establish strong relationships by and large with them. So like this one says, they feel like a very extended family, that you meet at the occasional family barbecue and you'll talk to them and then go for 4 years without seeing them and not think twice about it. They had distant relationships with siblings who had remained with birth parents and hadn't come into care or be placed for adoption. A very high proportion had post-adoption contact with at least one birth parent. And in fact, only 4% of adoptees had no contact with any birth family member. That means neither birth parents, nor siblings, nor grandparents, nor aunts, nor uncles, nor anybody. Most of them had contact, almost all of them had contact with at least one family member. 87% had contact with a birth parent. It reduced as adoptees grew older, but it persisted with their birth mothers for 40% of adoptees, and 35% of adoptees continued to have contact with their birth fathers by the time we did the survey, which was on average 18 years after they had been placed with the adoptive families and 13 years after the adoption order. They had, of course, had a lengthy period while they could have had contact while they were being fostered by the adoption parents. So the arrangements for contact had already been clarified before the adoption order was made very often. At the time of the survey, 56% of adoptees were still in contact with at least one birth family member. And in 40%, it was positive and uncomplicated. However, about 60% of adoptees, over half of the adoptees and the adoptive parents and birth parents, found that contact was difficult and painful and often very negative indeed. This is mandatory contact. It means that they had very little option but to agree to contact, and the children had to go to the contact sessions. So the positive remarks about contact are very helpful, I think. You know, so some adoptive parents found it was very useful to allow them to form a friendship, and that helped the child to feel comfortable, said one adoptive parent. Our child enjoyed the contact, and so did we, said another. I found it nice to be able to talk to their family, just to be supportive and involved, help them to be supportive and involved in their lives. So there were very positive remarks from some, but 60% of them found that it was difficult. And these are the drawbacks. There were significant practical problems. It was difficult for adoptive parents to pin birth parents down to come at a particular time, for instance. After the order was made, it was left up to the adoptive parents. They had to make the arrangements as well as to take the child to the contact sessions. It was hard to get hold of birth parents. It was their mobile phone. They didn't always have mobile phone contracts, or they weren't able to answer the phone. There were huge issues about secrecy for some of them. We've seen that the children were very significantly abused before they entered care. And some of the birth parents were quite violent and were considered quite a threat to the adoptive family. So there were really difficult issues about how they could get to a contact session, which, if it was likely to be difficult, was held in Bernardo's offices. How they could get there without the birth parents finding out where they lived, for instance. So there were lots of sort of cloak and dagger stories about how they'd sort of got into a taxi so the birth parents wouldn't be able to find their address from their car number and that sort of thing. It was often very stressful for children. Many of the children didn't want to go to contact sessions. The interviews reveal numerous stories of children whose adoptive parents took them there very unhappily, and then they would have a treat afterwards. They'd go to McDonald's afterwards to cheer up afterwards. One of the reasons it was so painful was that it illuminated the poor relationships that the birth parents had with the adoptees. So this young woman said, I felt so let down by my birth mother, by my grandparents. This one didn't have a good relationship with the grandparents as well as the birth mother. I'd come home and we'd be driving back for 2 hours and I'd be sitting in the car crying until I fell asleep because we'd spent 3 months pretty much apart, and I'd see her and she wouldn't spend time with me. She'd be on her phone or she'd be off doing something else. Or when I spent time with her, she wouldn't want to talk to me. So it was hard for me to want to go back. But she was my birth mum. And so it was always a part of me that was very excited. And I'd see her and it would be a huge letdown. And I think we get this tension between wanting to see the birth parent and then not wanting to be let down. That comes out again and again in the interviews with the children. Contact also illuminated the birth parents, some of the ongoing issues that the birth parent had to do with drugs and alcohol, for instance. Some of them turned up to contact sessions under the influence, and others took an opportunity during the contact session to say to the child, don't you worry, you won't be living with your adoptive parents for long. I got a room ready for you. We're going to go back to court as soon as we could. So it unsettled the children. And it wasn't about creating happy families. And I think that's a myth that we like to tell ourselves. Certainly, before I did this study, I had assumed that a lot of the content would be about establishing good and positive relationships. That didn't happen. Some of the birth parents moved on, like the birth mother in the quote. And when they'd moved on, they were not interested in the child who had been adopted. They had new children and a new partner, and the adoptive child was no longer a priority. So as this young woman said, my birth mum, she likes to brag about what her life is like now, and it's hard to hear. She'll say she's married and that her husband has a child and that child will do Mother's Day with her, those sorts of things that, of course, are hard to hear because she's never taken any pride in my life or has done anything like that with me. Other children developed a relationship with their birth parents where basically they were supporting the birth parent rather than the other way around. And this young woman, so she calls me daily. I don't answer every call. I talk to her. It depends. If I'm really stressed at uni, I can go like 2 or 3 weeks. I do try to talk to her once every 2 or 3 weeks. And many of them, I think the feeling of agency, that they were in control of the contact, helped them to establish a relationship when they wanted to do so, but also to keep that relationship at arm's length a bit, which helped them to come to terms with it. But the main reason why contact ended was because the adoptee decided not to persist. Contact was mandatory until they were 12 years old, when they could ask the court for it to be ended, and the court would take the child's wishes into consideration, but wouldn't necessarily agree to it. I think they're in this study, all those who asked how contact ended did actually happen. Was it worth it? It sounds very difficult, doesn't it? Was it worth it? Well, 69% of the adult adoptees and 69% of the adoptive parents thought that it had been beneficial. 60 of the adoptees were over 18 by the time we did the study, so there are quite a few of them. And most of them thought that it had been beneficial, even though they had often hated it at the time. There were really sad stories about adoptive parents insisting on children going in spite of the fact they really didn't want to. So why, what were the benefits? Well, first of all, contact promoted the development of a sense of identity. And I think that was really important. Being in touch with a birth family member, particularly with a birth parent, it helped them know where they fitted in. And they could say things like, you know, I can see that my red hair comes from my dad, or my eyes are the same as my mum's, or my mum says that my grandpa had the same nose as I got. That sort of thing was very important to them. And the few children who didn't have contact raised that as an issue. One of them said, if one of my birth family walked past me in the street, I wouldn't know if it was them. So those things mattered a lot. It facilitated a sense of continuity, belonging, and connectedness to the past and present. And that, I think, is important. There's some very interesting research undertaken by the University of Vancouver, looking at how children's sense of past relates to their commitment to the present. And those children who are able to relate their past to their present, to be able to make that link and to conceptualize that they are the same child as the one in the picture of them as a baby, they have much more investment in the future and are less likely to develop very self-destructive behavior patterns in the future. It helped children understand why they couldn't live with their birth parents, and that was really significant. As they got older, some of the teenage adoptees were allowed to go, and the adoptive parents let them go and spend a day or two with their birth parents, and that was almost universally rather disastrous, I think. There are quotes from teenagers saying that they'd had to ring up their adoptive parent and say that their birth parent was offering them drugs, or they were drug dealing, could they leave straight away, that sort of thing. It helped them understand that they couldn't really live with their birth parents. It promoted what I think was very painful transparency for everyone concerned. It's hard for children to understand that their birth parents are not in a position to look after them. It was painful too for the birth parents to see that their children were usually thriving with the adoptive parents, but it did mean that the birth parents couldn't really hold on to the view that the adoptive parents were wicked people who had stolen their children away. And similarly, it was painful for the adoptive parents to be reminded regularly that the child was not originally theirs, that they weren't the biological parents, but it did help the adoptive parents let go of the fantasy that the birth parents were wicked people who had nothing to recommend them. And where it was successful, contact enabled the adoptees to come to terms with their past and move on. And it was those adoptees who in the interviews didn't dwell exclusively on option, being able to move on and put it behind them, who did successfully when they came to be adults. And in some circumstances, contact was extremely successful, and members of the birth parent family were sort of incorporated into the adoptive family, and vice versa. They invited each other to family occasions, weddings and things, that sort of thing. How did it affect the relationship? Well, did it jeopardize the placements? Well, a high proportion of the adoptees were still living at home at the time of the survey, including a third of those who were over 18. Most of those who left home had done so for normative reasons. The average age of leaving home was 21, and a lot of those over 21 were still there, so it would go up. However, the disruption rate is 13%, which is relatively high, but we have to remember that these are late adoptions, often of older children who have had difficult experiences in care. So it's not, it's quite a positive figure if you look at that. A high proportion of the adoptees had run away or moved away temporarily out of the adoptive home. And 4 of the adoptees who had permanently left home had moved back to their birth families. That's not a high number, 10%, having permanently moved back to the birth families. The relationship with the adoptive parents was very positive, and it continued after they'd left home. So a very high proportion of the adoptees had continuing support from adoptive parents after leaving home. And some of the adoptees who'd gone back to their birth parents were still being supported by the adoptive parents. They communicated quite regularly with their adoptive parents. These are the adult adoptees who had left home, a third at least once a week, a quarter less than once a week, but at least once a month. When I look at this, I think about how often my adult sons communicate with me. And although 14% of them never communicated with their adoptive parents, or very rarely, 4% of Australians never communicate with their parents, and 40% of Australian care leavers are not in communication with their last foster carers. So a good rate, I think, of communication. And we found 8 adoptees, 8 out of 93, who had either no ongoing relationship with the adoptive parents or only a minimal relationship. That, I think, is a high level. It's a very low level of complete disruption of the relationship. They were very well integrated with the adoptive parents. There's lots of quotations about making the commitment for life. They talked about the adoptees as their son or their daughter. Most of the adoptees felt that they fitted in very well with their adoptive family. They thought social workers made a good match. And what I think is really important is that 70% of them never or hardly ever thought about being adopted. It no longer dominated their lives, and that is really significant. I'm sorry, it's hay fever. When we did the survey, which is on average 18 years after they had been placed, only one of the adoptees who were able to follow up was living with a birth family member. Others who had left the adoptive home to live with their birth parents were no longer living there. The few adoptees who claimed that contact had been discouraged or denied had notably worse relationships with the adoptive parents, and they also had the least successful adult outcomes. It wasn't contact, but lack of contact that tended to destabilize placements. And that, I think, is because the adoptive parents who discouraged contact tended to denigrate the birth parents. They did so during the interviews. They did so sometimes in the survey where there was a place for text. And of course, the children knew that contact should have been encouraged. They knew that it had been agreed. So they felt that their adoptive parents had let them down and had lied to them when they said that they would promote contact. And of course, the grass was always greener on the other side. So it was lack of contact that destabilized placements. Well, let's just spend the last few minutes looking at how relationships between adoptees and their birth families and their adoptive families affect their developmental trajectories and adult outcomes. When they entered their adoptive homes, there's significant evidence about developmental delay, poor mental health, problems at school. And from the interviews, constantly the children talked about anger, how they had been an angry child, how they had smashed things and broken things in fury, and the adoptive parents so much the same. There was little evidence of incipient psychosis, and I think it's about 11% who went on to develop schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, that sort of issue. There's a lot of evidence of poor mental health, but not psychosis at entry to the adoptive homes, and that much of that continued, as we shall see. We can compare the adoptees' outcomes with those of a cohort of care leavers in New South Wales that were about the same age as the adoptees. And so it's not a perfect comparison. We think it is quite valuable to be able to look at this. So compared with the care leavers, the adoptees had very good rates of qualifications, of university attendance, full-time education and employment. They starred the percentages that have a star beside them. There's that indicates that there was a significant difference. So they were significantly better educated than care leavers at adulthood. And in fact, their education is not that far off the education data for the normative Australian population. However, the adoptees, issues concerning substance misuse, the adoptees, 37% of the adoptees had issues with substance misuse, only 17% of care leavers. That's a significant difference. Problematic substance misuse, a high proportion of adoptees, and they had more mental health issues than the care leavers did. I think this is probably because These adoptees are the children in care who cannot go home, and whereas care leavers may have remained in care throughout their childhood, there would have been an expectation at some stage that they would have gone home. There was no expectation for these children, and it is because of the significant levels of abuse that they had experienced before entering care. Compared with the care leavers, a high proportion of the adoptees were functioning successfully, in adulthood. And we had a sort of composite variable that enabled us to look at that. The factors that related to their adult functioning were, first of all, polyvictimization. Those adoptees who before entry to care had experienced more than one type of abuse, so physical abuse and sexual abuse, and also some of them had experienced emotional abuse and neglect as well. Those adoptees were the ones who had the most significant experience of abuse and neglect, and that remained associated with poor adult functioning. Uncomfortably, this is a significant finding, statistically significant, face-to-face contact with birth fathers related to ongoing mental health issues in the adoptees. Now, many of the birth fathers were very frightening. They had been very violent, and this is a negative finding. It may well be to do with poor management of contact, re-traumatization, all sorts of issues concerning the way in which contact was handled, and the question about whether, in fact, some birth parents should not have had contact with their children. Virtually all of them did. There was one birth father who was not allowed contact. There were two birth fathers who was not allowed contact, but all the others had it. And those two, one of them had murdered a child, and the other one was very, very violent. The other statistically significant factor was we had a variable about sensitive parenting, where we asked them whether their adoptive parents listened to what they said, whether they could talk about what they needed to their adoptive parents, whether their adoptive parents were supportive of them and were sensitive. And those adoptees who said that had been the case had significantly more successful adult functioning than those adoptees who said no. Factors that are not statistically significant because we don't have sufficient data. Those adoptees who had achieved closure and come to terms with their past appeared to have more successful outcomes than those who did not. We didn't have enough data on this variable to be able to test for significant, but certainly there was a noticeable trend in that direction. Well-managed contact, we don't know enough about that, but we think that was a factor in successful functioning in adulthood, and we need to know much more about that. But the commitment of the adoptive parents is very clear. So the adoptive parents were exceptionally committed to the children, and this is true, of course, of adoptive parents the world over. But we have a lot of information from the Australian parents that we don't always have from other studies, because we were able to interview so many of them. And also the children as well, who talked about the adoptive parents. And these parents, they sought out specialist psychotherapeutic help. They weren't going to just have what was on offer. They made huge efforts themselves to get extra help. They walked into the schools and argued with the teachers when the child was excluded, and insisted on them being in a set that they felt was suited to their needs. They continued to support the adoptees when things went wrong. Some of the adoptees had very poor outcomes in adulthood. Some of them were in and out of prison, for instance, or in and out of prostitution. One of the key factors, though, of the adoptive parents was that they didn't abandon them. They were still supporting young adults who had not managed to function independently in adulthood. They were picking them up and setting them back on track again whenever something went wrong. They showed permanent commitment, and they The adoptees talked a lot about how they had a permanent home and this was their real family, and so did the adoptive parents. They had made the transition from being the children's carers to thinking of themselves as the children's parents, with no difference between the adoptees and their own children. We don't know how that happens, but we need to know more about how people manage to make that transition, because it's that really that's at the heart of this commitment that the adoptive parents had to the children. Well, there are a number of messages for policy and practice. First, about post-adoption contact. Some of the things I think Barnardo's got wrong, and in fact they've made some changes following this research. They've taken this research on board and have used it in all sorts of ways. There are harrowing stories of children who were forced to go to contact sessions when they were desperate not to see birth parents who had abused them. Not surprisingly, some of the birth parents brought the abuser with them to the contact session. They couldn't get a lift from anybody else, they said. Things like that, so we needed to listen. They needed to listen more to the children and take their views into account. But on the other hand, we do need to remember that most children felt that even when it had been painful, contact had been beneficial. There needed to be better boundaries for birth parents. They needed to know that they couldn't turn up at contact sessions under the influence of drink, for instance. The birth family members needed a lot more support. It wasn't about creating happy families, and it's unrealistic, I think, to expect that it would be. Even those adoptees who had relatively positive relationships with their birth families didn't have fully committed, very, very happy relationships with them. They'd reached an accommodation with them rather than developing a strong relationship with them. And very important, I think, that adoptive parents need to be present. Most adopted children benefit from continuing face-to-face contact, and particularly grandparents need to be remembered, and siblings. It was possible for Barnardo's to recruit adoptive parents who would support contact, but they needed to know that that was going to be the case and not have it landed on them after the child had been placed. I think that the requirement for contact also meant that the adoptions were not that different from long-term foster care, particularly because most of the adoptive parents had fostered the child for a while before they were adopted. And I think that should be a consideration in setting eligibility criteria for recruitment and training. To adoptive parents need to know how to manage contact, for instance, just as foster carers need to. And finally, outcomes. When it's undertaken within an appropriate ethical and rights framework, open adoption can provide greater stability, a stronger sense of belonging, and better support for young people making the transition to adulthood than care can provide for abused and neglected children who cannot return home. That's an important finding, and one I think that's been replicated by other studies. Adult outcomes for adoptees also tend to be more successful than those for care leavers because of the commitment of adoptive parents. If you're a care leaver, you may be lucky. You may have foster carers who will continue to support you right through your life, but it's good luck if that happens. With adoption, it's part of the deal. The commitment of adoptive parents acts as a powerful protective factor, and we need to understand how that happens. And most children who've been adopted from care have experienced significant maltreatment, so they may need to access post-adoption support right into adulthood and beyond, indeed. So I'll leave you with a final word from the adoptees. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harriet. I just need to read that.
Oh, sorry. I'll read it out. I guess we were lucky. I guess I have to take that under consideration as well. Me and my sister could have went through foster home to foster home. And this one, adoption will literally change your life, mostly for the better. Although there's a lot of emotional stress and confusion, there's also a sense of stability in your life. You feel like you belong to someone and a part of a family, as though you're worth being cared for. I think that was very indicative of what they felt.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I ask you to drop your slides, and then apparently this makes it easier. Thanks, Harriet. So there are a couple of questions in the chat. One is an observation, and then there's a question in two parts. The observation comes from Chris Holmquist, who's saying it's very interesting and positive research, and he welcomes it. He just wanted to clarify that the figure of 16% of children leaving care in Wales, it's actually quite a bit lower. So the figure is typically less than 5% of children looked after who are adopted. And last year, 285 children were adopted in Wales. And he says, if by comparison, there were 7,080 children looked after at the same time. So it's more like adoption is accounting for about 4%.
I'm very sorry I got that wrong then. I was looking up the statistics and I must have mixed up the tables. Apologies for that. I'm sure you're right.
But the substantive question is in two parts. So do you have a view whether the fact that the contact was mandatory was helpful or unhelpful? He says it seems like very few families defied the court order for contact, and goes on to ask, were those that did not comply subject to significant sanction?
There was no sanction at all for those who didn't comply. It's quite likely that nobody knew that they hadn't complied until we did the research. I don't think there was, that they weren't followed up by Bernardo's after the adoption order until, well, on average, 13 years later. So nobody knew whether they had complied or not. So it's only if the courts had found out that there could have been sanctions. What happened though was that the children were very, very antagonistic towards these adoptive parents, and basically the placements, the ones that I can think of 3, there weren't very many. They broke down, the placements didn't survive. So in the first part of the question was, whether it was mandatory, whether that helped. I think it did. I think because it was part of the plan, it was clear for everybody. It wasn't an option. You couldn't say, well, I don't think we're going to do this. The birth parents knew that they were expected to remain in contact as well. The adoptive parents had been trying to think of a word that isn't too extreme. They had been told again and again and again that contact was absolutely necessary, and the training was very much about how vital it was for the children to know their origins, to have contact, how important it was. So they didn't query it. I can't think of a single adoptive parent who said, I don't, well, apart from the ones who didn't persist with the contact. I can't think of any of the ones who persisted with it, who questioned it. They didn't like it being, I mean, I think it was over the top. I think Bernardo's, and I think they would agree, actually. I spoke to the chief executive not long ago. I think that because it was mandatory, they didn't ask themselves, is this actually a good thing for this child? And one or two of the adoptees' interviews indicated, there's one where the young man said, I think it would be much better if I'd had indirect contact for a few years until I felt that I was able to meet with them. I was so frightened of seeing them. I was afraid that they would kidnap me and take me away again, and I was terrified. But I would have liked to have got back in touch when I was older, but not had to be in touch all my childhood. Yeah. So the problem is that you get this set, when something becomes a really clear policy, you don't ask questions about the value of it, and you tend not to challenge it. And I think it could have done with a few challenges a bit earlier, really. Yeah. So they needed to modify it, and they needed to manage it better.
Okay. Just to add that Suzanne Griffiths, who's the director of the National Adoption Service in Wales, has just clarified some of those figures. So I'll just very quickly say, it isn't wrong. It's 16% of the children who leave care each year, but 45% of children in care each year. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, is that the same as mine? I can't.
Oh, probably. Anyway, so I got 2 questions there. Oh, 3 questions. There's more questions than we've got time for. So what I'll probably do is we'll get these questions across to you, so you can get a feel for it. Right. So Sarah Coldrick asks, Harriet, this is such useful research for those of us working for modern adoption here. My question is whether you think the fact that the prospective adoptive parents were foster carers and supported as foster carers first helped with that successful transition from carer to parent.
Yes, I do. I think it was because one of the things that I think was very helpful was that they'd had to have contact while the child was in care. Although, as we've seen, a lot of the contact had ceased by the time the child was adopted, and then they had to re-establish it for some of them. But it was part of the deal when they were fostering the child that they would expect to have contact with the birth parents. So they very likely met them before the adoption was an issue. And I think that was helpful. I think having a lot of support from Barnardo's for that period. There tended to be late adoptions in that there was a lengthy gap between placement and order. And some of Julie Selwyn's research suggests that the longer the gap, the more vulnerable the placement, I think. But that, I think, is because those gaps may be because adoptive parents are wondering whether or not it's a good idea or not. And once there's a question of doubt, then it's less likely to be such a secure placement. But these, they weren't wondering, it was part of the deal that they would have to foster for a while before the adoption order was made. So I think it was very helpful that they were foster carers before they were adoptive parents. But what happened once the adoption order was made was that they had no support. They could go to Barnardo's and say, I'm not getting on, what can we do? And Barnardo's would signpost them to the universal services, but it was felt that they needed to become a normative family, and therefore they shouldn't get any specialist support. And that again is something I think they've reconsidered since.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Natalie Robinson observes that this work is very interesting in terms of the importance of contact in relation to life journey work. And she says at the moment these are often seen as discrete entities. I think at the moment there's a lack of understanding, Ari, what life journey work really means, and that recognizing that it's a process rather than a single event. I think you'd probably agree. I'll move on to the next question.
Okay, absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Helen Hawksworth from what was Apa Cymru, Harriet. She says, thank you, Harriet. Your research is so interesting and beneficial to us in Wales. Can I ask your view about whether we need to think differently or more about sibling contact from the early stages and ongoing, and whether this should be in some cases prioritised over contact with birth parents?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I don't think I'd know whether you'd prioritize it over birth parents. It depends on the relationship with the birth parents and the siblings. I think sibling contact is very, very important for children, but I think like the whole issue, you have to be really careful not to make a blanket assumption that it's always going to be a good idea. Mostly it was positive, but there were some cases where it wasn't. There was one family where the sibling was abusing there were three siblings placed together, and the older sibling had been very significantly abused himself, and he was abusing his sister. And she couldn't say anything. They were placed together, and nobody was going to say, well, he shouldn't be with you. So each case needs to be looked at on its own merits and on its own issues. With it at the back of your mind, you need to be aware that very often sibling contact is very beneficial for children, and in most cases that will be the case, but not always, I suppose.
Thank you. A couple of comments from Shamin Raj, who says, open adoption is very common in my culture, and I welcome the introduction of open adoption in the UK. I know and see great value in open adoption. And they go on to say, I started asking on initial visits if they wish to consider open adoption, as this is something I would like to promote. I also, thanks. And then Anne Bell, who's the lead for Adoption UK in Wales, Harriet. She says, really interesting research, Harriet, and it really resonates with comments I'm hearing from adult adoptees in this country about the difficulties that come from not having any contact, even though they have become aware that contact would have been challenging too. contact with good support must be the best option. So yeah, those are some positive confirmations, I think, and reflections on practice in the UK. Oh, there's another one. So Wendy Keedon from St David's Children's Society says, thank you, Harriet, fascinating research. Again, thinking about how adoption is viewed and reframing this as a positive option for some children will be powerful when considering the right permanent care planning decision. Yeah, it feels collectively across these comments, Harriet, that we all as a community need to look at your work now, and it's great that it's open access. And as we continue the conversation in the UK, are you still in contact with the Australian organisations, and is the conversation carrying on post-publication?
Oh, very much so, yes. The chief executive of Barbados is very, very supportive. I mean, it's slightly awkward because you don't want to be too close to the organisation. You don't want accusations that you were all in it together, and obviously that they have a vested interest in it being positive. But you know, they've been very helpful and receptive to the negative messages as well as the positive messages. Something I didn't get in, and maybe didn't focus on enough, that might be worth considering too. There's a lot of evidence about adoption for children who cannot return home being having better outcomes than care does. And I think, well, the Australian care system, there are issues similar to the ones that we have, of course, about care leavers. I think we have probably more support than they often do in Australia. But I think it does really show up the issues in the care system that need to be addressed, as well as the positive impact of adoption.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to draw the talk to a close. We will capture it all. Everyone's saying thank you, and some really thoughtful comments. I know you can't read while you're trying to concentrate on the screen, but we'll get those across to you, Harriet. Thank you to the more than 70 people who have attended this at the start of their working week. And Harriet, I just thank you so much. I think there's a lot here for us all to go away and reflect on, and your talk was incredibly clear and so well paced. It's a webinar I've actually able to maintain my concentration with for the full hour. So thank you so much. And I'm sure you might be contacted offline in the future, because this is groundbreaking.
Well, you've got my email address, the Oxford email address. You're welcome to contact me, and I will try to respond to any questions.
Thank you. There's lovely comments coming in. I know you can't read them all, but thanks everyone, and we'll close the call now. And thanks for coming. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, Harriet. Thanks so much.